to start. I'm Eriko Sato. I coordinate the distinguished lecture series for the Center for Multicultural and Intercultural Communication, which is MIC. The MIC brings to Stony Brook cutting-edge research that address today's urgent and important questions that arise through globalization. Welcome to the first MIC lecture in this semester. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the FAST Research and Interdisciplinary Initiative Grant and the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies. Today, we are extremely privileged to have Dr. Karen Ogulnick, Associate Professor and Director of TESOL Bilingual Education Program at Long Island University. Dr. Ogulnick earned her PhD degree in English education and applied linguistics from New York University. Her areas of expertise include TESOL, bilingual and multicultural education, second language, and literacy acquisition. She is the author of Onnarashiku, I can use my Japanese pronunciation here, like a woman, the diary of a language learner in Japan, and she's also the editor of Language Crossing, negotiating the self in the multicultural world, and has published a number of scholarly articles about language acquisition and identity in multicultural context. Please join us welcoming Professor Oberwick.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Eriko and Agnes and the rest of your team here for inviting me here and all the preparations that you've made for my visit here. It's truly an honor and pleasure to have been invited to speak here at Stony Brook, and in particular this very exciting and dynamic center for multilingual and intercultural communication. It is said when you share your passion, you have an opportunity to inspire others. Well, nowhere is that truer than my passion for learning languages and cultures while traveling. I evoke the travel metaphor because it's travel that has brought me here today. And I guess it's brought many of you here as well. How many of you were born overseas and learned English as a new language? Awesome. How many of you were born here and went overseas and learned another language or languages? I'm in this group. And who here managed to learn another language here in the United States other than English to develop proficiency? Bravo, that's impressive. And who are the lucky ones who were raised in bi or multilingual home environments? Well, I say you're the lucky ones because it's lovely to learn a language through family members, and it's a precious gift to give a child. As far back as I remember, I had a desire to travel and learn other languages. I remember sitting in the library and daydreaming about all the places in the world that I wanted to visit. Rather than reading my textbooks, I'd pore over atlases, mapping my journey around the world. One day, I realized my dreams could become reality when I spotted a poster announcing study abroad opportunities. So this was my big chance. Oops. Oh, here we go. And the next semester, I was off to London for a semester abroad, which was really a prelude to a year of traveling around the world and a lifelong journey through languages and cultures. In London, I was housed in an international student housing hotel. Many of my friends happened to be from Asian countries, and I spent many evenings with them sitting around and listening to stories of places that they were obviously homesick for, and tasting delicious foods from their cultures, which of course made me interested in visiting these places. So when British Airways announced a special from London to Hong Kong for £99, I was very interested. And remember, this was the days that Hong Kong was still under British colonial rule, so there was a lot of travel back and forth, especially around the Chinese New Year. My friend encouraged me and said, if you go to Hong Kong, you can stay with my family, and I'll meet you for the Chinese New Year. So that sounded great. And then another friend said, well, after Hong Kong, why not visit Thailand? You could stay with my family in Thailand. So I thought this was amazing. And unbelievably, another friend invited me to Malaysia, said they had people I could stay with in Malaysia, and before I knew it, I was also invited to Singapore and Indonesia. So how can I turn down an incredible opportunity like that? So sure enough, I did buy the ticket, one-way ticket to Hong Kong, and I visited all those places, plus a couple more, and visited the family and friends of my friends in London. And it was wonderful to be 19 again and footloose and fancy-free. As I traveled from one country to another in Asia, I made every effort to communicate with people, whether through gestures, basic English, facial expressions, a smattering of expressions I picked up, basic English. I was eager to connect with people and their cultures. Fortunately, at that time, there was no Google Translate, because if there was, I wouldn't have become as confident and adept in my ability to communicate non-verbally. Okay. I would have loved to have developed proficiency in one of the languages, but I wasn't in one place long enough until I went to Japan in 1985 to teach English in Japanese public schools. Well, today there are many Americans teaching English all over Japan. In 1985, I was the only American in the rural region of Western Honshu where I was assigned. I lived in a small town called Takefu in Fukui Prefecture. Is anybody here from Fukui? No? Inaka no Tokoro desu. It was very beautiful. I loved it. I was surrounded by rice fields, mountains, the Sea of Japan. There were hot springs, delicious seafood. The people were very kind. But because I was the only non-Japanese person, American teacher, I did a lot of traveling, and I got to see a lot of the countryside, and I had many opportunities to meet people and improve my Japanese language. But I found learning Japanese to be a struggle. And I attribute this mostly to the fact that after 6 years of studying Spanish in school, I still really hadn't developed communicative competence in Spanish. So I asked myself, if I couldn't learn Spanish in 6 years in school, how am I going to learn Japanese in 1 year without any formal language study? So I sort of just muddled along the best I could, and although my interest was very high, my expectations were low. But after about 3 months of hearing the same expressions on a daily basis, polite greetings such as Ohayo gozaimasu, good morning, konnichiwa, good afternoon, some talk about the weather, atsui desu ne, samui desu ne. My personal favorite was oishii desu, which, as you know, means it's delicious, because in those pre-verbal days, food was main source of communication between me and many of my new Japanese friends and colleagues. I recall the exact moment when I realized that I was actually beginning to learn Japanese. I was riding on a streetcar one day on my way to work, and an elderly woman entered the train and sat down next to me and began to speak to me in Japanese. Well, I had memorized an expression, which I promptly recited for occasions like this, which was, "Zen zen wakarimasen." I don't understand a word of what you're saying. But to my surprise, this didn't seem to faze her, and she continued to speak with me. And I just smiled and nodded as she spoke, and when we arrived at her stop, I waved her off with sayonara. But once alone with my thoughts, I had an epiphany. A light bulb went off in my head, and I said, wait a minute, I just understood what she was talking about, and that was entirely in Japanese. So that really opened my eyes and made me aware that I was actually acquiring the language. So this was very motivating, and from that moment on, I immersed myself as much as possible in Japanese and began to study the language more wholeheartedly. Okay. Developing Japanese proficiency and the friendships this enabled me to forge was a key factor in extending my stay in Japan from 1 to 2 years, and then coming back for another 2 more times for another 2 years. My desire to fit in as much as possible to the society that was nurturing my Japanese language skills and new persona encouraged me to produce softer, more polite, and refined ways of speaking. I didn't notice how this was affecting me physically until the first time I saw myself on a videotape that was recorded at the end of my first year in Japan. I saw myself sitting on my knees, covering my mouth with my hands, speaking in a high-pitched tone of voice, and giggling, and I wondered, who is this non-Japanese woman who seems so Japanese? I knew that she had my face and hair, but my body seemed to belong to another person. Similar to the way people sometimes tell fellow travelers their life stories, people I hardly knew shared intimate details of their lives with me. I was told stories of forced arranged marriages that, quite frankly, made me feel relieved to be an American woman. I believed I was freer than the Japanese women that I had met. When I returned to Japan in 1993, I saw things quite differently. This time, the experience of looking at Japanese women seemed more like looking into a mirror, not one that reflected back my exact image, but one that revealed, even where there were differences, much about the condition of being a woman in my own culture. My inside-outside location as a participant observer gave me a unique vantage point from where I could observe oppressive structures in both Japan and the US, particularly how they related to women, which is difficult to do from a space within the culture. It was from this location, right in there, that I could more clearly observe the socially constructed nature of identity. I have previously written about the importance of linguistic self-reflection and introspection as a way to deepen one's understanding of the affective variables that come into play when learning a language. The genre has been referred to as diary studies, first-person case studies, linguistic narratives, memoirs, autobiographies, auto-ethnographies, among others. While these genres do overlap, there are some key distinctions. Diary studies are self-reflections that learners systematically record in a journal in order to raise metalinguistic awareness of their language learning processes. Diaries can help language learners become more aware of inhibitions, strategies, biases, and patterns of interaction that may interfere with their language acquisition. Diaries also provide very useful feedback to teachers by enabling them to become more aware of the internal processes beneath the surface that are difficult to observe in a classroom setting, which is often just the tip of the iceberg. My first book, Onarashiku, Like a Woman, The Diary of a Language Learner in Japan, was based on a diary I kept while learning Japanese, which I analyzed using introspective and retrospective research methods. Whereas autobiographies and memoirs seek to explore who am I, auto-ethnographies are more concerned with how have I been shaped by cultural, linguistic, historical, and socio-political forces. Anthropologist Ruth Behar described autoethnography as an intermediate space we can't quite define yet, a borderland between passion and intellect, analysis and subjectivity, ethnography and autobiography, art and life. In Autobiography and Overview, Carolyn Ellis, Tony Adams, and Arthur Bachner describe autoethnography as an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze personal experience in order to understand cultural experience. This approach challenges canonical ways of doing research and representing others, and treats research as a political, socially just, and socially conscious act. Hewan Chang has written a guidebook to conducting autoethnography called Auto-ethnography as Method. And her book includes writing exercises and techniques for gathering and interpreting auto-ethnographic data using ethnographic research tools. Chang has created this auto-ethnographic triad, which consists of self-reflections, cultural interpretations, and ethnographic research. Since I observed changes in my perceptions of identity while learning Japanese, I was interested in investigating how other people made sense of their experiences learning languages. I explored this topic in my book, Language Crossings, Negotiating the Self in a Multicultural World, which is a compilation of auto-ethnographic narratives of people's experiences learning languages in different contexts. The main questions that emerged from the narratives were, how do people negotiate their identities through different languages? What role does power play in people's abilities to acquire languages? How does language learning interact with people's psychological, emotional, sociocultural, historical, economic, and political realities? How can the process of writing autoethnographies reveal learners' linguistic and cultural socialization processes? And how can autoethnographies help to recover forgotten or denied aspects of self and society? In addressing these questions, I'd like to share excerpts from some of the narratives that speak to the language and identity negotiation process. Pramila Venkateswaran who is an English professor at Nassau Community College and was also named Poet Laureate of Suffolk County, wrote a piece entitled Language, Exile, and Memory, in which she described a perception she had that learning English was a way of liberating her as a woman. It wasn't until she immigrated to the United States from India, and after being removed from her native language, Tamil, did she realize that that the cost of colonization had really had an impact on her. And this led her to excavate the language, culture, and relationship with her mother tongue that she had silenced in order to be successful in English. As she wrote, "I experienced my exile with pain. I did not fit into my country. I did not fit into my family. I felt I was being educated to live away and apart from my parents and what they had known. During these years, I felt my exile as a woman for the first time. In rejecting the oppressiveness of society's attitude toward women, with systems like dowry, lack of choice in marriage, and so on, I felt the opposite pole, or safe haven, was westernization, which in my imagination stood for freedom. My paradoxical situation was that I felt liberated as a speaker of English, but without its rewards in the form of choices to me as a woman. In my exile, I had felt that only knowledge of English could open up avenues of freedom for women. But in delving into the Tamil stories I had heard in my youth and in the fiction I'm now reading, I'm finding Indian women who are passionate, forceful, empowered, and imaginative, showing me paths within my history and culture that colonialism and English education had kept away from me." Susan Driscoll, a biracial Korean American, described a similar experience of loss and reconnection to her mother's language, Korean. Her piece, entitled Language is More Than Words, speaks to her early internalization of Korean language and culture as an inferior other while growing up in a white suburban community. Internalizing the racism of the dominant society, she once asked her father to find her a mommy with blonde hair and blue eyes. It wasn't until she had gone to Korea and learned Korean that she learned to embrace her, that she embraced her Korean, her bicultural identity, which naturally strengthened her bond to her mother. As she wrote, "Once when my mother called from the United States to speak to me, she mistook me for one of my Korean roommates. I felt like we were two different people when we spoke in Korean together. It must have been a joy for my Korean mother to speak to her American daughter in her mother tongue. By communicating in Korean, we connected in a way that had never been known to us, yet neither of us could or felt we had to explain it. For me, it was like discovering a whole new side of myself, or perhaps rediscovering what I had been so out of touch with for years. I was no longer confused about what it meant for me to be Korean, nor was I ashamed of saying that I was Korean American. I finally felt good about my bicultural background, whereas in the past, it was some kind of curse." Many of the authors describe the immigrant experience as that of fragmentation and reinvention. Going through a process of metamorphosis, they transform themselves or their personas through each language and culture they encountered. Marina Stefan, a Swiss-German writer and immigrant to Montreal, wrote about her experiences living in broken languages. In her piece, playfully entitled, "Here's Your Change and Enjoy the Show," she described how she assimilated new words and idiomatic expressions, and related how being an immigrant gave her an opportunity to literally change her mind as she moved from one language to another. Preferring to see the world as her home base, she embraced her identity as other, because it represented stimulation, language, and opportunities to change. As she wrote, "In a world of more than one language, there is language in abundance. There is stimulation in abundance to literally change my mind. Given the chance to change one's style, the habitual way of thinking, the grammatical structure, I take the opportunity to change my writing and therefore my nature. I grew up in a house of shy and broken languages," I wrote at the beginning of this text, "and I already no longer know how to translate this sentence into German. I would have to write it entirely differently in German to begin with. And right now, I wouldn't know how. It has slipped my mind, yielding to something to come." Christina Madova, a Bulgarian writer, translator, polyglot, and professor of media and communication at Springfield University in Alabama, wrote a piece entitled "Looking for the God of Languages," in which she similarly described how acquiring different languages allows her to transcend herself and embody other languages and cultures and expand her range of emotions. "Learning a language makes me a child again. I blunder all the time, and the others seem to excuse it. Switching into a foreign language, I feel playful. I am a kid who has suddenly been given a new set of toys to replace the old one she was bored with. Every object around me has been renamed. I develop a fresh interest in it. Is it really the same? What kind of game is this? Saying hello in Japanese requires a bow. And here I am, humble and obedient as I would never be in English. Speaking Russian, I tend to use diminutives because they are typical of the culture and somehow expected in the language. I suppose this makes me look more emotional and sentimental than I normally am. Am I misrepresenting myself? Surprisingly enough, I do feel somewhat emotional and sentimental when I'm speaking Russian. The very language I'm using has changed me. The point is, just using appropriate words, I look reserved in English, rational in French, affected in Italian, as the respective cultures require. I am putting on different faces, and I seem to be doing this in order to be accepted, to be liked. As in a desperate love relationship, I'm trying to please the partner I'm with to the point of not being myself." And in this next paragraph, she whimsically expresses her love for languages. "Speaking a foreign language, I'm a mechanic with a special instrument, a person of status, a conqueror, a master, a person with a hobby, a sports person, a structuralist, a mason, an artist, a philosopher, a hedonist, a scholar, a priest, an actor. I am in love and I am young. I am a multiple personality. I am a goddess." Well, if that isn't inspiring, I don't know what is. But on the other end of the spectrum, Robert Roth, an American writer and poet who lives in New York City, wrote about his painful struggles, not only learning languages, but also with his native language, English. He traces his difficulties to his father, a Hungarian Jewish immigrant who is never comfortable in English. In his essay called "Random Thoughts on My Inability to Learn Languages," he conveys how non-standard forms of language are often not appreciated and recognized for the expressive and positive qualities that they often have. My problems with English, my native language, are pretty acute. Only every so often can I write anything that makes any sense. Usually it is incoherent fragments written in a totally illegible scrawl that even I can't read. It is only very rarely that I'm able to enter the space where I can communicate with written words. When I can, I can. It is almost as simple as that. My father was never comfortable in any language. My friend Paula, on the other hand, seems more comfortable in Italian than in her native English. It is as if she had been born into the wrong language. I remember seeing her, actually spying on her from a distance, speaking Italian to a friend. Her hand gestures, her facial gestures, her body language seemed so much more at home in Italian than in English. I spoke to her about what I had observed. She said, yes, it was true. It's amazing to see people and the changes they go through with the language they are speaking, how their gestures, the timbre of their voice, the depth of their laughter, their body language are all affected by the language that they are speaking. As for speaking English, it astounds me when I hear myself on tape to think that anyone can understand a word of what I say. Mostly sounds, a few expletives, a few key words, a bunch of you-knows, and that's about it. People have to work hard. Maybe that's the key. Or maybe they just, I don't know. Anyway. These narratives have led me to question and rethink my pedagogy and practice for preparing teachers of speakers of other languages. In particular, I wondered, how can teachers make the identity negotiation process more visible and explicit for language learners? What tools would help facilitate this process? Okay, in order to begin to answer these questions, I'd like to invite you to participate in a very brief visualization activity. If you'd like to participate, please close your eyes, take a deep breath, and reflect on a time when you felt silenced or not perceived in a way that you perceived yourself or wanted to be perceived. Where were you? Who were you with? What were you talking about? How did you feel? Was there anything in the words or structure of the language or cultural expectations that conflicted with your sense of self? Try to recall as many details as you can.
Hardship.
Sorry?
Hardship.
Hardship?
We should remember, learn and times to keep those words in mind. And these things. I think the key is hardship.
Your hardship in learning language. Well, I encourage you to hold on to those thoughts and impressions. And actually, I'd like to encourage you to take a moment. I see many of you have your notebooks out. So take a moment and jot down any key words or expressions or impressions or feelings that you may want to retain or revisit sometime in the future. This is a way to begin to explore the auto-ethnographic process of critically reflecting on a moment of language learning. And it's very important to capture these moments of tension and discomfort because they can easily dissolve without actively and critically reflecting on them. So I'll give you a moment to jot down any thoughts that may have come up for you. My journeys have led me to conclude that the best way to prepare students to teach culturally and linguistically diverse learners more compassionately, ethically, and creatively is to encourage them to travel and deeply explore other languages and cultures. Since I believe that an important part of traveling is learning not only to accept and tolerate the ambiguities and confusion, but to embrace them, I want to provide experiences in which my students' worldviews will be challenged. Whether real or metaphorical, travel provides a unique opportunity to transcend the self and experience another persona in a different linguistic and cultural context. And this could certainly foster increased curiosity, understanding, and imagination about the world. Thank you. Arigatou gozaimashita. Muchas gracias.